What is up, beloved baddies? Today we talk to Jessi Knippel, who is an academic, writer, and artist pursuing a PhD in religion and gender studies. Her research, are you ready for this, includes European witchcraft / witch trials, religion of the Atlantic world, post/ex-Evangelicals and religious deconstruction, Evangelicalism in the U.S., high control group / emerging religions, i.e. cults, Deviant Sex Cults, I know, right? Syncretism, and folk practices in religion, as well as pop culture and religion. This episode is for you history buffs and or nerds or witchy nerds. We go through the history of colonial witch trials, why certain people groups were targeted as witches, and the role that Christianity played in these hunts. Then we move to the present day, to the modern day, and how cycles of religious and political and economic control continue to police women and other marginalized peoples. Also, shout out to Rachel Stolpe, who was our first ever patron on Patreon and has been basically a super fan of the podcast since its beginning. Just wanted to let you know that I think you're great, Rachel, and thanks for being a patron. For your bad homework of the day, I guess I'll be assigning bad work, I don't know, each week. If you all could go write a review of the Called to Be Bad podcast, it's especially helpful on Apple Podcasts, I guess. If you could go write a quick review saying what you like or don't like or whatever about the podcast, apparently that really helps things. So, yeah, go do that. Okay, bye!
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, you know, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today.
For the few male elites in power, they had to decimate the women and non-white people and other males that didn't fit within their structure, as they did the earth through colonialism, to maintain the illusion of their power.
Welcome, Jessi.
Thank you.
So this is Jessi Knippel. I saw Jessi's bio on Instagram, and it said something about like religion, sexuality. There was something else in there, and I was like, this sounds like my cup of tea. What's the proper metaphor? You're singing my tune, you're speaking my language.
I'm your flavor of ice cream, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I'm really excited to have you on to talk about witchcraft and colonialism, which, like, I'm so excited about, but it's, like, actually a really sad topic, and so I don't know what to do with this excitement. I think it's because it's one of my interests that and so you get excited about something like, oh, I, like, studied this and wrote a paper about this, but it's also acknowledged, like, it's not like fun stuff. Before we dive in, Jessi, what are you drinking today? Tonight, because it's evening. Tonight. If you've noticed the different lighting.
Yeah, it's like late night on my East Coast time. I am drinking. This is really lame. So a couple months ago, I was at the grocery store buying groceries late at night and got 2 bottles of Seagrams for why the fuck not? They were like $1. So I'm drinking the Bellini from Seagrams because my oldest kid has to be at school by 8 a.m., which is just brutal. And I have it in my Homebrew Christianity People's Theology cup that I got from Trib many years ago. So
nice. And I have. Okay, are you ready for my mug?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love it.
It says "Resting Witch Face."
That is awesome.
I'm so
I gotta
pleased
get that for my advisor.
I'm like choking because I'm so excited. Yeah, so it's a mug. It has a white outside and an orange inside. It says "Resting Witch Face," and it's very full. And so I'm like embarrassed to admit like what is inside of it. Well, because I mixed a few things because I thought that like
So I realized I didn't have any alcohol in the house, and I was like, I want to do a fun drink. We're meeting in the evening. We're talking about witches. And so I called my friend who was going to come over anyway, and I was like, hey, do you have alcohol at your house? Can you bring whatever you have? And he was like, yeah, sure. So he brought over this beer. It says a lager for the lakes. It's like a blue, I don't know, American lager. It's like, yeah, a summery light beer. It doesn't have a lot going on. And he also brought over rum. And we had cranberry juice in the fridge. And I was like, would it be really gross to mix beer and rum and cranberry juice? And I was like, I'll try. Your face is like skeptical, or are you like, no?
I know. I'm like, that makes sense. Like, I don't like beer. I'm not a big beer person. When we go to places that have beer, I either get cider or I get sour beers because they don't taste like regular beer.
Yeah.
But I mean, it makes sense. I've been like getting a sour beer that's got Skittles and like Twix in it. So I mean,
Twix,
to each their own. Yeah.
Well, that's basically what I created, was like a sour that had like a little bit more kick to it with the rum. And it actually it's actually not bad. It's weird, but it's not bad. So cheers. So we are talking about the witch trials. Can you tell us, like, from like a fifth grade, like, it does not have to be like super complicated, and just, you know, we can be honest, like, we're simplifying it. It's probably very complicated, but from like a very basic level, what are the witch hunts? Why did they start? Who are they punishing, condemning, etc.?
Witch hunts run from the 1400s to 1700s. So that's around 1500 to late 1800, like mid 1800. And they come out of the early 1300s, 1200 and 1300s, where the Catholic Church at this point, because we haven't had the Reformation yet, is trying to get rid of quote unquote heretics, right? And that also includes getting rid of Jews. So we start to see mass push of Jews out of places like Spain and Italy and other Western countries in this kind of 1200s to 1400s period, along with forced conversions. So we also have this history running tangentially of forced conversions from Judaism to Catholicism. Specifically, a lot of that's happening in Spain and Portugal, which is why you get a lot of hidden Jews in Mexico and Latin America, which is a new space of research where people are finding out they're Jewish from their matrilineal lines, and they have these Friday night rituals that they didn't realize were Shabbat. Oh. So that's happening. We're prosecuting people who are perceived as heretics. And the punishment for people who are not being forced converted, or who are being, through those forced conversions, accused of being a Kabbalah of evil. So that phrase, so do you remember Pizzagate? So that is an example of a Kabbalah of evil. It's basically a conspiracy theory believing that there is an elite group of people who are engaged in unnatural sex acts, however you define that, sex with children potentially, as one of the pedophiles, as one of the indicators, cannibals in some form, people who are feeding off of other people in some kind of blood ritual, right? Which are all things that were accused of early Christianity by the Roman government, which is ironic in this conversation. So early Christianity, 1st through 5th century, the Christian church is being accused of being a Kabbalah of the evil practices that engages in all of these things. But as power switches and we enter Europe in around the 1300s, those things are then being transposed onto Jews and heretics. So Jews and heretics are now, and lepers, are now being scapegoated as the cause for any social harm or evils or plagues or any famines happening, because they are engaged in these practices of cannibalism, inappropriate sexualities, and something to do with children, whether it's eating them or having sex with them or both. So you start to run out the Jews, and you're killing off Jews and cannibals or lepers, and you've gone through this whole heretics thing. A lot of other things are going on too, right? So we have the political shift from more agrarian, feudalistic society where there's open spaces that are community spaces happening, where the poor are being cared for in the community through notions of Catholicism where you are required to take care of the poor, and so you give alms and you give food and you give shelter to the poor. And as we see that social structure of feudalism shifting, along with the Reformation, which is shifting from a Catholic modality to a sola scriptura modality where we have a lot of different factions and they're all fighting each other, and a Protestant worldview is starting to form that is both very heaven focused in a way that Catholicism wasn't at the time, because there was more sensual aspects of Catholicism that kept things rooted. And it's not to say that Catholicism was doing great, because the history of the church is bloody and messy and horrible. But with the rise of Protestantism, we're getting away from a communal mindset of salvation or communal engagement as a factor of salvation to an individualized, heaven-focused mindset with the rise of a merchant class. So the rise of capitalism, the privatization of those shared communal spaces. And so all of that is kind of fusing together. And with that, governments and the various religious factions have this incentive then to start forcing everybody to move towards a more nuclear family structure, which was not part of the thing. You also have the guilds, the rise of the artisan guilds from the 13th to the 15th century. And so these are more like a worker-owned, workers have power kind of movement where people had a lot of control over who they worked for. So it's that shift from feudalism where your allegiance is to one sole person. It's a very hierarchical structure, to guild structures where there's much more camaraderie and communal structures. There's still leadership hierarchies, there's still gender issues. And within the guild structures, and even previous to that within a feudal structure, notions around marriage and family were more communal. Marriage wasn't as big a requirement to have children. There were a lot of, for various reasons, there were a lot of family structures that weren't necessarily legally married in the sense that we think about it. And so with this kind of Protestant rise, the individualism of that, the capitalism, the privatization of that, you start to see government push alongside the church with a more nuclear family to control the rowdiness of the guilds and some of that, to push for marriage, to push for starting to villainize pregnancy or loss of pregnancy in a way that wasn't. Frederici talks about, she has a quote, and she says, "Women were persecuted for witchcraft in this period, the 16th and 17th century, so the latter half of the witch trials, more than any other crime, with the exception of infanticide, which is being prosecuted for killing your child, or in what was often happening is being prosecuted for having miscarriage." Because suddenly, the quote I can't find is, suddenly it talks about how in the 16th century, France, who had never recorded miscarriages or birth loss before, is suddenly requiring people to record their birth losses, to record whether or not a child is born in a wedlock situation or not. And so there's all of these moves to more conservative governmental structure that's aligned with the church. And so we have all of that happening. And then adjacent to this, in Spain and in Germany to some extent, we're also having a lot of theological schools, Toledo being the biggest one, so Toledo, Spain, doing work around demonology. And demonology inevitably leads to having conversations around magic and witchcraft. And that also leads to the angry little man who wrote Malefice Maracarum, The Hammer of the Witches, and a lot of that coming out of his frustration, think he's in a Scandinavian country. I think it's Denmark. And he comes in as the priest and he's like, I'm going to put these people in place. And the women are the ones who lead to his removal. And that leads to him writing Malthus Smartcarm, which is where we get a lot of the tropes of witchcraft. And almost all of that is completely made up out of his own sexualized, crazy, sadistic head. And so we have all of that happening together, and it just kind of implodes in the right ways to start prosecuting mainly older women, mainly poor women, mainly women who are seen as sexually deviant, people who are not fitting into perceived gender culture roles, people who maybe are having mental health issues, things like that, seen as aggressive. So that's when we start seeing kind of the rise. And it depends on what country you're in, right? There's a great book that precurses Caliban and the Witch called Witch Haze by Anne Lewin Barstow. And it's an overview of just the various different countries and what their witchcraft outbreaks look like. So it's kind of an overview. But she kind of talks about it like Germany is one of the places where there was the most amount of witch trials and horrific witch trials and prosecutions. And there were several villages in her research who were left with like one woman by the end of 50 years of prosecution.
Can you say that again? There were many what?
There were several villages in Germany that were left with like one or two female people within their community after 50 some years of prosecution. And there's this really horrific story in both her book, I think, Caliban and the Witch maybe, and then there's another book on like ritual that I read in one of my grad programs that has nothing really to do with witchcraft. It's just the festivals and rituals of the 13th and 15th century that describes this whole family who is brutally tortured and murdered in front of the community for being witches. And so this is, it's more extreme in Germany. Depending on where you're talking about, there's a lot of different factors that are functioning into why there's a lot of persecution or where there's a little persecution or how that persecution functions, because there's certain legal codes that in certain places make less people get accused, or if you accuse somebody, in some places there's this code where if you accuse somebody and you're found to have accused them falsely, then you get prosecuted. So that kept a lot of those accusations at bay. So it really depends on what context in Europe you're talking about as to how severe and how bad and everything. But it's fascinating, right? It's like scary and sad and horrible. And stuff, but it's also interesting to see from a back perspective, what are the politics at play? Which contexts have higher rates of persecution? Why is that? Things like that. How is the Reformation playing into that? How is the rise of capitalism playing into that? Things like that.
And how these women or marginalized peoples were essentially caught in the crossfire between different church institutions like Catholicism and Protestantism, trying to like prove that the Bible was legit, and to do that they needed to prove that angels were real or heaven was real. And in order to prove that angels existed naturally, you needed to prove that demons existed, and to prove that demons existed, you had to essentially torture or force women into saying, yes, I had sex with a demon. At least that was I wrote a paper in seminary called "The Crime Against Women: Accusations of Demonolatry and Witchcraft as Subordination and Social Control." So that was my takeaway. That was like, I don't know, 7 years ago. So correct me if any of that is wrong.
Yeah. No, totally. That's part of what Frederici talks about in her book, is that this is a form of social control, not only for the women, but for the men, because it's nobody was wanting these moves to more conservative views of family and sex and work and things like that. But for them to have the human capita to continue the colonial project, they had to move towards these things and to continue the power holds that are happening with the Reformation, both in the Catholic Church and in the Protestant Church. Yeah, and it's like Frederici talks about it again. She says, the political nature of the witch hunt is further demonstrated by the fact that Catholic and Protestant nations, at war against each other in every other respect, joined arms and shared arguments to persecute witches. Thus, it was no exaggeration to claim that the witch hunt was the first unifying terrain in the politics of the new European nation-states, the first example, after the schism brought by the Reformation, of European unification.
And so, like, what I focused on in my paper was that a lot of it had to do with, like, essentially putting women or other minorities in their place to keep them at the bottom of the social hierarchy, which would then line up with their worldview and theology. And you're saying, yes, and there were political, economic, like, so many other layers that kind of provided fodder for these witch hunts.
I have this great quote. It's by Frederici, and it's basically talking about, for the few male elites in power, they had to decimate the women and non-white people and other males that didn't fit within their structure, as they did the earth through colonialism, to maintain the illusion of their power. And so you have all of this going on, and it's in certain pockets, right? It's not universalized in the way that it's happening either. Like, England is notorious for having some of the lower amounts of witch trials, and they're generally not as many people die. But the English model gets transported to the US and to the Caribbean and to North and South America. And it's the model on which, with some variations, the Salem witch trials happen. It's the model on which some of the other stuff that I'm researching happens. And the persecutions in Latin America and South America, which I did not want to touch because I did not want to have to learn Spanish on top of everything else for my dissertation. But that's all happening together. And yet there's also, like, the other thing that I'm planning on including in my dissertation is forms of resistance. So one of the interesting cases that I've come across is the Basque region of Spain, which is in between Spain and France, if I remember correctly. It's one of the few places where the men revolted against the Inquisition coming in and starting a witch trial. They were all off fishing, and the Inquisition came in with their examiner and started witch trial, and they came back and they kicked them the fuck out. And they were like, nope, you're not persecuting any of the women in this community for witchcraft. So there are, like, stories of resistance in the midst of all of this too.
In part of my research, I came across a story about how once colonies had moved to what is now the US, and they were kind of replicating this witch hunt, how that some of it was also to keep women out of religious spheres, like to keep them from preaching. And so, and I don't remember where it's from. I have here, I'll show my books here, and so I can say it's from one of these. So I have my book. You can tell me if you use any of these. I have a book called Demon Lovers. This is a fun one. Fun one to have.
I do not have that one.
Yeah.
Ooh, that sounds awesome.
And then I think this is where I got the story. It's The Devil in the Shape of a Woman. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So in one of these, it told the story about Quaker women were treated, it was like a little bit more progressive, and so they were going around and they were evangelizing, and some of the Puritans heard that there was a ship coming in and there were Quaker women on the ship, and they were like, oh no, these women are going to come and try to preach and evangelize. And so they got on the boat before the women could even get off, and they made them strip down to see if they had the demon's mark. And then they declared them witches, and they didn't let them come into the US. So do you know anything of, like, what is the demon's mark? Why did they talk about it? Like,
okay, so this is one of those stupid things that's made up by Spengler in the Malthus Mark-Arm. And it's the belief that there's some mark, which is usually like a mole or something like that, and it looks like a tit. And so it's where your specters, your familiars, right? So where they're animal figures who feed on those, supposedly feed and suckle on those marks. So one of the other scholars I'm reading is, the book is like Maleficent Motherhood. So she talks about like there's reversals on the assumptions of motherhood happening in these conversations. And so it's a reversal of the notion of breastfeeding because it's supposedly they're feeding on blood versus milk. And so much of what is coming out of the Malthus Mark-Arm's notions is either like crazy sexual fantasies or these reversals of traditional structures. So like previous to the Malthus Mark-Arm, the devil was commanded by the witch or by the magician, right? And that comes back into play in the 18th century when we start talking about people doing sorcery and alchemy. And that's part of like this early practice, and it's still even happening in the midst of the witch trials. People are doing alchemy because they're men, so it's acceptable. A lot of what gets written off as inappropriate action by women is like totally acceptable from men in like the Greek context, in the Roman context, in the Middle Ages context. But anyways, it's reversals, right? So post Malthus Mark-Arm, the witch is no longer in command of the devil. They're married to the devil because they have to be subservient to a patriarchal power. And so they have these reversals of marriage and the reversal of Catholic Mass, the witches' Sabbath, which, by the way, there is absolutely no archaeological evidence that anybody started doing witches' Sabbaths until the reenactors in the late 1800s. So all of this is based on like just complete and utter fantasy, right? But it's reversals of Catholic Mass. It's reversals of the notion of traditional motherhood. It's the reversals of notions of traditional marriage, of sexuality, of things like that, that they're mostly creating in this text based on their own misogynistic views and their own like sadosexual desires, right? What angry little short men will do when they have the power.
I think we pretty thoroughly covered like the past. Can you carry us to like how this relates to now?
Sure. We live in late stage capitalism. So capitalism, the fusion of capitalism, specifically Protestantism, is a big thing that we deal with, right? We see that in the religious right in the Republican Party marriage. We see that in the way in which megachurches function. So we see it in these like systems that are being origined in the 1500s or earlier. So we have still today megachurches, evangelical megachurches, that talk all about earth doesn't matter, heaven is your home, you get to heaven, you and Jesus, say the salvation prayer, which is nowhere in the biblical text. And this individualized salvation model that prioritizes non-here and now for a possible future heaven, which I would say doesn't exist for humans. And they're using it to rake in massive amounts of money. So we have this capitalistic aspect happening. We also have the rise of the religious right and the Republican Party in marriage with the religious right, along with organizations like QAnon that are evangelical adjacent, but they pick up a lot of evangelical jargon, evangelical theology that is dispensationalist theology. So dispensationalism is the Left Behind series theology. It origins mid-1800s in Scotland. It's not very well known. Maybe it's early 1800s. It's not super popular. Some groups like the Seventh-day Adventists that origin in the 1850s and LDS, Latter-day Saints to some extent pick up some of that. But mostly it's not really a major factor theologically until the late 1800s when it starts getting migrated over to the US. And it begins to infiltrate, but doesn't have a lot of power until the 1950s and 60s. And really the 70s is when it becomes absolutely insidiously blended into every denomination of Protestantism, with maybe the exception of the UUs, because they've always, Unitarian and Universalists, because they've always kind of been on the more progressive side. But we get that rise in like everybody being all about the end times kind of notion through the text. Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, that's all of this apocalyptical reading of Revelation in a view that it's linear, which it's not a linear text. And that you can mark out when it's going to happen based on world politics, which you also cannot do. Dan McClellan, the religion scholar who does a lot of stuff on TikTok, has several really great videos on why those kinds of readings of the text are just complete bullshit. But Lindsey's book is a bestseller. It's a New York Times bestseller. And then the early 80s, in the 80s, you get the LaHaye Jenkins Left Behind series, which is building off of those same viewpoints that the Antichrist is going to rise and it's going to happen in America and it's going to happen in our time. And this becomes a widespread view that was not a widespread view previous to that. And it really affects political policies. I mean, it's been affecting political policies, that apocalyptical notion in the US since its origin, but really affecting like geopolitical policies, Christianity worldviews, internationally, nationally, all of that stuff. And so that's where dispensationalism really gets its teeth into Protestantism in the US and contours a lot of how people think of the world and the globe and who's after you and who's bad. And then that gets co-opted by the fusion of the Republican Party and the religious right. And then you end up with QAnon conspiracy theories, which are functioning in that same mode as the 1980s Satanic Panic and the 1300 prosecution of heretics and lepers for all of the things that we talked about before the beginning, with there's people doing things that we think are sexually weird and inappropriate, children are involved, cannibalism is involved, and some kind of blood ritual is involved.
Yeah.
So that's where you get Pizzagate. Or the notion that, Biden is surviving off of the blood of other people, or Hillary Clinton is surviving off of pedophilia, sex trafficking ring, of blood fusion something, which is complete bullshit.
And it takes attention away from organizations that are actually trying to stop or mitigate harm in sex trafficking and etc.
Yeah, 100%. Like Tim Ballard and his movie Freedom. What is it? Freedom? Yes, Sound of Freedom. I think it's Sound of Freedom, where it just came out that he's got multiple allegations of sexual assault by women that he supposedly saved. And there's documentation from some ex-Mormons that I've seen that he came up with the whole thing, sex trafficking organization, to make money, to the point where it's scandalous enough he got excommunicated or is being excommunicated by the Mormon Church, which takes a lot when you're a straight white male making a lot of money.
So again, we are circling back to themes of social control, religious infighting, political control, and control of the nuclear family and birth, and in particular women and other minorities.
Yeah, 100%. And all of that is deeply tied to capitalism and capitalistic structures that constantly need free or cheap bodies to dispose of through their labor, whether it's birthing labor, things like that, through this system. So there's not a space for queer people. There's not a space for autonomous female bodies because that disrupts the proclivity to produce more capita, right? It's the statement, I think it was Clarence Thomas, but it may have been one of the other people on the Supreme Court, maybe it was Scalia, who sided with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, well, we don't have enough domestic babies to adopt. So one of the reasons we need to overturn Roe v. Wade is so we have a broader amount of domestic babies to adopt, which disregards like the trauma and harm of adoption and the fact that like we have been, evangelicals specifically, have been involved in child trafficking through adoption in other countries for the last 20 years. But there's so many things tied up in this, right? Like it's autonomy of non-Americans, it's autonomy of non-Christians. It's like there's so many things that a white nationalist Christian movement wants to have control over and have power over because their worldview is not popular. And so they're going through legal structures to institute it, right? Nobody comes to faith through legal structures, but yet they want to control the narratives. They want to control what is read. One, so you don't know the histories of resistance. One of the scholars I follow on Instagram is talking about that. They're like, they don't want you to know the history.
Yeah.
They don't want you to know how people resisted.
I think that's part of why the idea of witchcraft or witches or supernatural, I think all of that is fascinating to me because it tugs at these strings of resistance, of deviance, against pushing against the status quo. And so it's neat to hear these stories about, when that is successful and not just punished. I guess one other curiosity I have, I saw this article going around online that was pushing back against, I think there was a TikTok sound or trend that was saying, like, we are the descendants of the witches you couldn't burn, or something like that. And the pushback was that it was commercializing and profiting off of people that were killed, that were murdered, not because they were actually witches or practicing witchcraft, because they were minorities for different reasons. So like a lot of my work that I did was really tied to gender and to how traditionally women were punished. But it's sounding like it wasn't just women. It was also men. That was one thing that article said, is that it misrepresents it because there were also men that were accused of witchcraft or demonology or whatever.
Yeah.
And that it was more like marginalized people, like you were saying, people with leprosy, or now we'd probably say like disabled folks, or religious minorities. So yeah, can you touch a little bit on that connection? Like,
yeah, totally. Yeah, that's part of what I'm looking at too, right? Is like practices of obeah, O-B-E-A-H, obeah. Obeah is not a religion. It's a sort of practices that origins in the Caribbean, but it's where you get a lot of the anti-witch prosecutions in the Caribbean. It's similar. It has elements that are similar to voodoo, to Santeria, because these are all hybrid religions and are all hybrid practices that are marrying animist or native practices coming from mostly Central Africa, and they're fusing with the indigenous practices of the Caribbean and of Latin America. There's a bunch of different religious practices that fall under kind of in a grouping with Santeria, voodoo, and obeah. Things in the south, practices that we would call hoodoo are also going to fall under those elements. They're not the same, but they're similar. They're all mirroring deities and practices that were coming from, and worldview coming from Central Africa, because that's where the majority of the slaves are coming, the Central African coast, with Arawak and other native indigenous peoples worldview and practices, which are similar, right? The rituals and the practices are similar in the way in which witches are even understood in, a African context based on what I've read, and the Native American practices. Witches aren't good or evil. They are good or evil based on the outcomes of their practice. So if their practice leads to harming another person, then they are a sorcerer and they are evil. If their practice leads to healing a person, they are good and they are, doing that good work through alchemy or through the use of herbs and things like that. And even in the European context, we have groups like that in Italy. There's a group of people, I cannot remember the name of them right now, but they're people born with the call, the birthing on their bodies, and they are fighting witches. So even in some of the Inquisition trials in Italy, we see this group of people who believe themselves to be good people fighting the evil witches who are doing harm. And they there's a Italian scholar that teaches at UCLA that has a book, and that's one of his books a little bit too broad, but one of the stories that he tells is about this group of people in the Italian context. So we have the marrying of all of this, and then it gets fused with Protestantism and Catholicism as a way to practice, and with the syncretistic practices, because we had synchronistic Catholicism in places like the Congo and other countries that were early interactors with the European colonial project into the African continent. And so there's a long-standing history in places like Ethiopia and the Congo of a form of Christianity that is a cultural form of Christianity, like all forms of Christianity are, and that has these worldviews contoured by the cultural dynamic, seeing good and bad based on the outcome practice versus this is all good and this is all bad, more Western linear practice. And a lot of the basic magic rituals that are happening, say in the Salem witch trial, the practice that Tituba gets accused of is a egg ceremony. It's a fortune-telling marriage ceremony, or I think it's a marriage ceremony. No, it's not marriage, but it's like a simple folk practice, right? So there are also these simple folk practices that are very similar across Europe, across the Caribbean, across a lot of these different cultures, because there are certain practices that we all as humans do to delineate that are also being wrapped up in this and being perceived as evil practices, even though they're pretty common even to the indigenous Europeans who are coming into the colonial space.
So it is not as simple as colonizers are punishing minority peoples. They're punishing minority peoples because they are witnessing what they view as something that is foreign or even just slightly off from their kind of narrow view of what is good and what is orthodox. And so anything that deviates outside of these lines needs to be squashed. And
they're also the elitists who are trying to, a lot of them are higher class, right? So a lot of the conquistadors are upper class members of society. A lot of the practices are more poorer practices, right? Fred Ricci also talks about the fact that like a lot of the practices happen in both contexts, and they're accepted in one context because they would have no women back in Europe if they completely dealt with it in that way, versus in the colonies where they destroy. Like the colonizers have this fear of the indigenous people as cannibals, right? They build up this notion of them. They're deviant, they're cannibals, they're doing all of these things. And Sanaya Latham in her book, Lose Your Mother, which is all about slavery in the Atlantic context in Ghana, if I remember correctly, she talks about it as like the indigenous African people are afraid of the colonizers because they're literally being cannibalized. There's this really great book that I haven't started reading yet, but I have on my list, called The Edible Negro. And it's all about the actual cannibalization of bodies, whether it's physically eating them or through work and through slavery and through chattel slavery, cannibalizing whole populations of people as something that the colonizers are doing, and then projecting that onto the abused people as their fear of harm, which gives them the justification to dehumanize them and do that exact harm to them. So there's also that kind of feedback loop happening of like projection and harm that's really disturbing, but also interesting from a scholarly standpoint. Like, you're like, that's really fucked up, and yet what's the cycle? Is there a psychological term for that? Is it just gaslighting and projection, or is there something like unique to abuse factor in this kind of mass structure that's happening in the colonial context in Europe with the witch trials, and is also happening in the colonized context, where the people who are being placed on trial and being executed are being called cannibals and being said that they're eating people and they're draining their seed and they're draining their life force, when in reality the people who are putting them on trial and accusing them are actually draining those people's life force and taking away their lives and murdering them and killing them for no reason other than they've had conflicts for years, or they are not socially acceptable, or they are poor because Protestantism begins to villainize poverty and glorify wealth in a way that Catholicism theologically hadn't, in the same manner. So there's all of those kind of interesting dynamics happening.
I wonder if part of the article that I read was talking about how witches were often hung more than they were burned. Can you speak a little bit on like the manner in which witches in quotes were killed?
Yes. So yes, to answer your question, the manner in which people were killed did differ in place. So the burning at the stake is something that comes from the shift from just prosecuting heretics through that and lepers and Jews to that movement into witches. So we do have cases where in continental Europe, if I remember correctly, mostly that's where you're seeing the burning at the stake, right? Or burning on a pyrite. Or they'll torture them, they'll hang them, and then they'll burn them, or vice versa. Because heretics and treasonous action in Europe often can lead, at least in the UK, leads to you being drawn and quartered, which means you're pulled behind a cart, and then your body is broken in 4 pieces, and then you're burnt on a pyrite. So that's another thing that gets fused. Ironically, most of the UK and England and in the English colonies, you're mostly hanging for witches. You're not burning the bodies. It's mostly a hanging thing, which is why most of the cases, America and in the other colonized spaces, most often women are hanged versus burnt. But we do have cases in those spaces where there's both. And then there's also some cases where then the bodies are buried separately and in a different manner. So straight up and down is often the way, in some contexts, a potential witch is buried. Much like with some of the vampire mythology and the vampire craze that happens in like New England and pockets of Europe during the late 1800s, people are buried with stakes through their hearts, or they're buried. I was listening to a history podcast that was talking about people potentially being buried with like padlocks on their feet as a sign of witchcraft or potentially vampirism, the perception of vampirism, or with werewolves. There's these different practices. So that's all of that is at play too, depending on what your context is. But for the most part, early on it's burning, later on it's hanging, depending on your context. I think France tends to burn people at the stake because we have another witch-adjacent narrative in the late 1700s with the possession at Loudun, which is a Ursuline convent that is has this outbreak of possession after the witch. I think it's like 100 years after the last witch trials in France. And the accused is the head priest. And so there's this big performative thing that happens, and the priest who is accused of possessing all these women, who was sexually abusing or sexually using a bunch of women throughout his history, is burnt at the stake as an accused witch. So that continues, but it depends on the context, right? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. I was kind of making the connection also. So I come from the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, which, so we have like the martyr's mirror. A lot of early Anabaptists were martyred. And so that would have been in the stream that would be considered heretics, like kind of before, or like I'm just wondering like what the overlap was, and if like there were like heretics or like, like witchcraft and
there's both
Anabaptist heresy.
Yeah, there's definitely both, because I want to say you're talking 1500s, right, with the Anabaptists.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot of like the rise of Luther, and that's where you're seeing this like killing of pacifists, and weird, like, oh, it just blows your mind when you start thinking about it. We're going to kill you in the name of Jesus. Why is that a thing? There's probably definitely, I don't know of anybody specifically who's looked at it, but I'm sure there is overlap between the two. Because there's overlap between heretics and witchcraft starting in the 14th century, right?
Yeah, I guess I got a little bit of the wrong impression from the article, saying like, well, they weren't practicing witchcraft, which is true, but they were partaking in, like you were saying, like indigenous practices or kind of pagan rituals, or
not all pagan. Of them. They're not, like in the sorcerer, that's not necessarily a pagan practice. It's a folk Christian practice. So so you have like Orthodox practice, which is like, this is what the Catholic Church says we do. And in a lot of colonialism and just a lot of Europe, you have folk practice, right? So it's like your Baptist church down the street, Southern Baptist Church, says we don't believe in ghosts, right? But you have practitioners or elders who still go on ghost hunts. That's what we're talking about, is the discrepancy between the structure or hierarchical thing of this is what we do, and the actual embodied practices of the people who would still say, and you see this in Inquisition trials, you see this in the magic, you see this in the witch trial transcripts, you see this in Joan of Arc's transcripts, you see this in a lot of these cases. They're being accused by the people who write the law, so the people who create orthodoxy, as not being orthodox. But these people firmly believe that they are orthodox in their practices. I'm just doing I'm saying Hail Mary in this way that I was taught, or I'm aligning myself with the saints, from my Catholic practices, which is where you see the prosecution of Catholics in Protestant areas and the prosecution of Protestants in Catholic areas for witchcraft. Because they're aligning themselves with the other form of Christianity that has different precepts on how they approach practice. And so some of it is indigenous beliefs that they're being persecuted for, but some of it is just folk religion, like that say it's akin to going to Appalachia, and maybe the rituals that are associated with Appalachia, if you're in, well, Southern Florida is not a good example because there's a lot of different rituals, but you go from DC, where you have a very high church, you have this very narrow understanding, to Appalachia, which has a history of Christianity. It's rooted in the culture, but there are cultural practices like salting a door to keep ghosts out or to keep spirits out. Or here in the South, where you put a witch's broom up on your door so that the witch has to count all of the broomsticks, and so they can't come in. They can only come in at nighttime, and they can't come in if they're busy counting, Or in the Caribbean context, when there's a funeral, you lay out salt, you lay out rice, things like that, to keep the spirits in that passing in between time distracted, so they don't come in your house, so they don't haunt you. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. So many thoughts. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything you would want to leave our listeners with? Any misunderstandings that often come along with witch hunts? Just final thoughts.
I mean, as you've said over and over, and as I would reiterate, most of the people aren't practicing magic. And even if they are, most people practicing magic are not using it as a harmful thing. They're using it, as healing practices, as folk practices, as ways to connect with the divine in the way that they understand it, whether it's a Christianized version or not. And anytime you see a group of people claiming blood rights, children pedophilia, eating children, cannibalism, and a secret group of elite people doing something, it is probably bullshit. Like any Kabbalah satanic panic, like the satanic panic, as we're seeing evidence now in the last couple of years, which a lot of us knew when it happened, is completely made up. It wasn't a real thing. So always be aware of like who gains, as I tell my students, when we're talking about politics or we're talking about religion or we're talking about like not connecting with otherness, right? Who gains by marginalizing these people, and what power structures gain by going after a group of people? And is that something you want to be aligned with?
Yeah, I'd rather do witchcraft, so no.
Yeah.
Gosh, well, yeah, thank you for this whole conversation. I know we went a little bit long,
Thank
but
you.
I was enjoying picking your brain. Would it be okay if I end us with a blessing, as is tradition? A blessing for Jessi, you and your family, and all of our baddies out there. May you go from this space full of curiosity for the unknown and a posture of thoughtfulness or questions when in the face of people that gain from marginalizing others. May you continue to ask questions and, I don't know, go in peace. Yeah. Well, thank you, Jessi, for being on. This was fun. Let's stay Instagram friends.
That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.